Texas, winter of 1880. A sudden noise made Elias instantly alert. The cabin door creaked open, letting in a blast of freezing wind, followed by the figure of a person collapsing onto the floor. Elias jumped to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle hanging on the wall. Lying in front of him was a native woman, tall, sun-darkened skin, tangled black hair, and clothes torn to shreds. Her deep black eyes were both defiant and desperate. She whispered, her breath barely audible, "Please, let me stay. I will work. Anything you need. I just need a place to keep warm tonight." For a brief moment, Elias saw the image of his former wife again, curled up in a sick bed, begging for a chance to live. His heart, long hardened by the years, gave a sudden ache. But life on the frontier had taught him to be cautious. He moved slowly forward, his hand still resting on the rifle's grip. Their eyes met. In hers, Elias saw no lies, only a soul worn down to its last thread, clinging to survival. He let out a sigh and pulled an old blanket over her shoulders. That night, while the snow continued to fall thick outside, inside the wooden cabin, two broken lives quietly collided, beginning a story no one could have seen coming. The fire in the stove crackled softly, casting flickering light across the hollowed face of the Apache woman. Warmth was slowly pulling her back from the edge of death, but Elias Boone's gaze remained ice-cold. He stood with his arms crossed, his tall frame shadowed against the wooden wall, the rifle still within easy reach. "What is your name?" His voice was raspy and measured. She hesitated, her cracked lips bleeding as she spoke. "Nayeli." The name echoed in the silent cabin like a confession. Elias glanced at her calloused hands, the old whip marks that ran along her arms. He had been right. This was no ordinary wanderer. "Why did you knock on my door in the middle of a snowstorm?" Elias asked, suspicion sharp in his eyes. Nayeli trembled, but forced her voice to stay firm. "I was left behind. I have nowhere else to go. I just need warmth. I will cook, clean, do whatever work you need. But please, do not turn me away." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of wind howling through the gaps in the door. Elias said nothing for a long time. Ever since his wife and child had died, he had not let another soul cross this threshold. And yet, those eyes filled with desperation and a raw will to live struck something deep within him, like a plucked string from an old guitar. At last, he spoke through clenched teeth. "Listen carefully. You can stay, but you work for your keep. There is no room here for anyone who will not pull their weight." Nayeli lifted her head, tears streaking down her sun-darkened cheeks. She nodded firmly, as if making a vow. Elias turned away, tossing another log into the fire. That night, he lay on his old wooden bed, rifle at his side, eyes wide open. Across the room, Nayeli curled up in the blanket, still trembling. Two strangers, from two different worlds, now sharing the same roof. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside, a fragile agreement had just been made, the beginning of a long trial neither of them could yet imagine. On the first morning after that fateful night, Elias Boone woke early, as was his habit. He quietly threw on his wool coat and stepped outside to check on the livestock, leaving the cabin behind with only the sound of wind howling and the biting cold. When he returned, he stopped at the doorway. The once cluttered room had been tidied up. The scattered firewood was now neatly stacked by the stove. Years of grime had been wiped away, and even his old coat with a long tear along the sleeve had been sewn up with rough thread. Nayeli stood there, her hands still trembling from the cold, but her eyes were steady. "I told you, I would not be a burden," she said softly, her voice both weary and proud. Elias did not answer right away. He simply set the supply bag down on the table, poured a cup of water, and handed it to her. That small gesture, to Nayeli, felt like an unspoken acceptance. In the days that followed, the old cabin began to fill with unfamiliar sounds. The clatter of knives on the cutting board, the soft creak of footsteps across wooden floors, the gentle stir of a spoon in a pot of thin soup. Though clumsy, Nayeli was persistent. The fire in the stove never died out, and for the first time in years, Elias had a meal that carried a hint of flavor, however simple it was. In return, Elias showed her how to lead the horses to pasture, how to mend the fence knocked over by the wind, and how to start a fire using dry wood during a snowstorm. He spoke little, but now and then, His steel-gray eyes glanced at her without the cold edge they once carried. At night, they sat quietly in front of the fire. The flickering flames cast long shadows of two people, a guarded white man and a scarred Apache woman. No words were exchanged, but the distance between them seemed to shrink a little with each evening. Once, when Elias saw her gently touch the whip mark on her arm, he almost asked, but the words never came. Instead, he slowly added another log to the fire. Deep down, he knew this woman carried a past soaked in pain and blood. The prairie outside remained cold and windswept, but inside the cabin, something had begun to shift. Elias, though he would never say it aloud, had grown used to the sound of a second pair of footsteps in the house, and Nayeli, still cautious, no longer flinched every time the cabin door shut behind her. They were still strangers, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was more like the pause before the first note of a song begins to play. The cold slowly began to retreat as winter entered its final month, but Elias Boone's wooden cabin still clung to the scent of smoke and a heavy silence. Days of working side by side had eased the tension, but both of them still seemed to carry invisible walls around themselves, until one night, those walls began to crack. That day, Elias got a long scratch on his arm while wrangling a crazed cow back into the pen. He just shrugged it off. Blood and sweat were part of the routine, but Nayeli insisted he sit still, silently cleaning the wound and wrapping it with rough cloth. Her calloused fingers trembled slightly, yet moved with care. Elias sat motionless, his eyes resting on her sun-worn face, where fatigue was etched deep. "Who left those whip marks on your arms?" Elias asked, his voice low and gravelly. Nayeli froze. Her hand tightened around the cloth. Her breath slowed, and her dark eyes wandered off into the void. Then, like floodwaters breaking through a long-block dam, her words spilled out. "They took me when I was still a girl, traded me, then sold me. When I was no longer worth anything, they left me behind. Even my tribe turned me away, said I brought misfortune." She let out a bitter laugh, one without any joy. "I survived, but I no longer have a place to call home." The room fell into a deep silence. The fire cracked and popped, its light reflecting in Elias's steel-gray eyes. He clenched his good hand, as if holding something back. Then, slowly, he said, "I lost everything too, my wife and son. Fever took them down in just a few days. I could not save them. Since then I buried myself out here, far away from everything." The confession landed heavy in the air, and in that moment, these two strangers realized they were not just sharing a roof. They were both survivors of loss, of abandonment, of fate's cruelty. Nayeli looked at him, for the first time without guarded eyes, but with a flicker of understanding. Elias turned away, but the heart he had long sealed off suddenly ached as if an invisible thread had just connected two broken souls. That night, the wind across the prairie seemed a little less cold. Inside the cabin, two people quietly shared their pain, and from that pain, something new began to take shape. Thank you so much for being here. If this story reminded you of old days of dusty afternoons and the sound of horses echoing in your chest, then please subscribe to my channel, so that every day we can sit together. And I will tell you another story from the West. Winter slowly retreated from Texas, leaving behind thin sheets of ice on puddles and a chill that drifted down from distant rocky hills. Inside the wooden cabin, the familiar silence had changed. It was no longer thick and stifling. It felt more like a shared breath, enough for two strangers to gradually learn how to exist side by side. One morning, Elias Boone returned from town with a sack of seeds. He set it on the floor, intending to lock it away in the storage shed like always. But then he paused, his steel-gray eyes glancing over at Nayeli, who was sweeping the floor. Sleeves rolled high, revealing a network of old scars. Elias hesitated, then slowly pulled a key from his pocket and placed it in her hand. "From now on, you keep it. The food, the seeds, they are yours to manage." Nayeli froze. That tiny key felt heavy, like a wordless acknowledgement. She held it tight, eyes shimmering but no tears fell. For the first time in years of wandering, she felt truly trusted. A few days later, Elias took a hard kick to the hand from a horse, and the wound swelled red and angry. He brushed it off, used to pushing through pain, but Nayeli would not allow it. She made him sit, then cut away the fabric, boiled water, and cleaned the injury. Her strong hands were clumsy but filled with determination. Elias winced, but did not stop her. He watched her sun-kissed face, the strands of black hair damp with sweat clinging to her brow, and saw in her a kind of care he thought he would never know again. "You need to rest for a few days," Nayeli said, her tone firm, almost commanding. Elias gave the faintest smirk, a hint of a smile breaking through years of gloom. He did not argue. From that day on, their work was clearly divided. Elias taught her how to handle the horses, patch saddles, while Nayeli took charge of cooking, managing supplies, and tending to him as his arm healed. They shared meals at the same table, worked the same yard, and still sat by the fire each evening. But now, the space between them was no longer a wall. It had become a bridge, built out of trust in small gestures, in brief glances, in unspoken nods. In the flickering firelight, Elias sometimes caught Nayeli watching him no longer with fear or suspicion. And for him, each time her footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, the house no longer felt too wide or too empty. Trust, the rarest thing on the frontier, had finally taken root in that lonely little cabin. Spring arrived quietly on the Texas prairie, not with a roar, but with the last patches of snow melting into gentle streams winding around the tree roots, and green sprouts pushing up through dry earth. For Elias Boone, it was also the first time in years that he felt something truly shifting inside his own home. One rainy spring night, the wind carried the scent of wet soil and the rhythmic patter of raindrops on the wooden roof. The cabin glowed with firelight, the crackle of burning wood drowning out the rain. Elias sat quietly at the table, his eyes following Nayeli's silhouette as she carefully mended the coat he always wore out to the fields. Those strong hands, once scarred and marked by lashes, now moved with surprising grace. His voice broke the silence, low and slow. "You do not owe me anything. Nayeli, you can leave whenever you want." She looked up, her deep black eyes meeting his steel-gray gaze. Her voice was soft but unwavering. "I know, but I do not want to leave. For the first time, I do not feel invisible." In that moment, something unseen bound them tighter. Elias stood, stepped closer. He placed his rough hand on her shoulder, hesitated, then gently brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek. Nayeli trembled slightly, but did not pull away. The fire danced between them as their shadows merged. Then Elias leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that was hesitant, unsure, but burning with a flame neither had felt in years. It was their first, clumsy, tender, yet fierce like a spark, reigniting long cold embers in two hearts that had nearly gone silent. That night, the sound of rain outside mingled with the rush of breath inside the cabin. They found each other not just through glances, but through old wounds, through shared loss, and through a deep yearning to belong. When dawn broke, they were no longer just two people sharing a roof. They had become something more, bound by trust and by love. Nayeli lay on her side, quietly watching Elias sleep. In her heart, she whispered to herself, "For the first time, I am no longer alone." News traveled fast on the frontier, faster than any post rider or telegraph wire. After just a few trips into Dry Creek to buy salt and bullets, the whispers had already begun. That widower's living with some Apache woman out in the cabin past the valley. At first, it was just murmurs. Then came the stares, sharp, pointed glances every time Elias Boone tied up his horse outside the blacksmith shop. Women pulled each other away from Nayeli whenever she followed him into town for supplies. Groups of men loitered outside the saloon, spitting on the ground and scoffing. Pitiful. His wife and kid are dead, so now he shacks up with a red-skinned stray like she's some kind of pet. Nayeli heard it. Her face burned. The dark eyes that once held firm now shimmered with held-back tears. But she bit her lip and said nothing. That night, back at the cabin, she quietly folded her clothes, the thought of leaving settling in her mind. But then Elias walked in, saw her, and his voice turned hard. "What do you think you're doing?" Nayeli spoke barely above a whisper. "I do not want to bring you shame." A long silence followed. Elias stared at her, his steel-gray eyes glowing like a fire catching wind. He stepped forward, grabbed her hand, rough, calloused fingers holding tight. "Listen to me. I do not need that town to approve of me. But I need you here. This ranch is mine, and it is yours too. You belong here." Nayeli broke down, her shoulders shaking. It was the first time in her life that a man had ever spoken words like that to her. The next day, Elias rode into town, but not alone. Nayeli walked beside him, head held high. The whispers returned, along with mocking chuckles. But when a drunken man stumbled toward her, reaching out to touch her, Elias grabbed the man by the collar and shouted for all to hear, "Anyone who lays a hand on her will have to go through me first." No one laughed after that. The street went dead silent, save for the horse's restless snorts. Elias let the drunk fall, then wrapped his arm around Nayeli's shoulder and led her straight through the crowd. From that moment on, the gossip was no longer just a joke. It became something no one could deny. Elias Boone, the widowed rancher, had chosen to stand beside an Apache woman, and he would never turn his back on her. Summer painted the Texas prairie in a brilliant shade of gold. The sun scorched the land. But on Elias Boone's small ranch, something else was quietly growing. Nayeli often held her belly, her calloused hands gently resting there as if listening to the life within. Her deep black eyes no longer held the despair of the day she first stepped into the cabin. Now, they shone with a mix of hope and quiet fear. One afternoon, as Elias returned from the fields, he found Nayeli sitting on the wooden steps, her eyes shimmering with tears. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Elias, I am pregnant." For a moment, he stood still. Memories of his wife and child rushed over him like a storm. The old fear of loss gripped his heart again. But when he looked into her eyes, Elias knew this was not the same pain. This was a new beginning. He said nothing. The very next day, he went into the woods, cut timber, and smoothed each plank by hand. For days, the sounds of hammering and carving echoed through the cabin. When Nayeli opened the storage room, she froze. There, beside their bed, stood a wooden cradle, sturdy, rough, but full of care. Elias, drenched in sweat, offered a quiet smile. "Our child will sleep here." Nayeli covered her mouth, tears rolling down her cheeks. She had never dared to dream that someone like her, abandoned and cast out, could ever have a home. A man who would call the child inside her our child. In the days that followed, they prepared together. Elias taught Nayeli how to till the soil to plant more corn. She stitched up an old quilt, turning it into a soft cover for the cradle. At night, they sat on the cabin porch, the breeze carrying the scent of wild grass, the sunset painting the horizon in shades of fire. Elias wrapped his arms around her from behind, his weathered hand resting gently on her belly. In that moment, all the judgment, all the whispers, all the years of isolation melted away. They were no longer outcasts. They were a family, a small home built with love and a trust stronger than anything else. And in that harsh land of the frontier, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the story of Elias and Nayeli came to a quiet close, like a rare, peaceful ballad where two broken souls found each other and chose to stay together forever. Dear friends, love on the frontier is not made of fancy promises, nor sweet songs sung over drinks. It is simple and enduring, like the wooden fences standing against the wind, like the fire that burns through the winter night. Elias and Nayeli did not find each other through fate, but through the courage to open their hearts after loss. In her deep black eyes, Elias found a reason to keep going. In his rough arms, Nayeli discovered that she was no longer someone to be cast aside. Their love was not born of sweet words, but of quiet acts of care. A hand dressing a wound, a loaf of bread laid on the table, a cradle built with sweat and belief. In a place where guns and prejudice always linger, the only force strong enough to stand against it all is love. It not only soothes old wounds, but builds a home, a place where two broken people can find themselves again. And that is the greatest strength of all, the strength of the heart. In the end, I always wish you a joyful and happy life. I love you, my dear audience of Wild West storytelling. Tell me what you thought of this story. Leave a comment down below. Type the number 1 if you enjoyed this story. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling tales from the Wild West.